Have you ever felt like you're getting better, but somehow you're still losing? Like you're doing everything right, taking your time, thinking it through, trying to be more careful than before, and still ending up in the same place. Not once, not twice, but again and again, in ways that feel different every time, yet always lead back to the same result. Another loss, another moment that made sense while it was happening, until it didn't. And the part that stays with you isn't even the outcome. It's that quiet moment right after, when everything stops and you're left alone with the same thought you've had before. Why does this keep happening to me? Because it doesn't feel random. It doesn't feel like you're guessing. If anything, you're trying harder than ever to do things the right way. You slow down, you think more, you try to avoid the mistakes you made before. And for a moment, it feels like progress. It feels like you're improving, like you're getting closer, like you're finally starting to understand something that used to confuse you. And that feeling is convincing. It tells you you're on the right path. It tells you to keep going. It tells you that sooner or later it will all start to work. My name is Edmund Hale, and over the years I've watched this happen more times than I can count. Not just to people who are new, not just to those who don't understand what they're doing, but to people who are thinking, learning, improving. People who believe they're getting closer, who feel like they're just one step away from breaking through, just before everything resets again. At first, it never feels like a pattern. It feels personal. It feels like your decision, your timing, your responsibility, something you can fix if you just look closely enough. You go back to the moment, you replay it in your mind, trying to find that one detail that explains it. And there's always something, always a reason that makes sense just enough to keep you moving forward. Maybe you were too early. Maybe you hesitated. Maybe you should have waited just a little longer, or trusted yourself a little more. There's always an explanation. Always something that feels logical. Always something that makes you believe it won't happen again. And that's where it begins. Not with a mistake. Not with a lack of knowledge. But with something much quieter, something that doesn't look like a problem at all, something that hides inside progress, inside logic, inside the belief that you're getting better. Because there's something about this process that no one tells you at the beginning. Something quiet, almost invisible. Something you don't notice while you're trying to improve. Only later, when you realize you've been doing the same thing for much longer than you think. It doesn't happen all at once. It builds slowly, almost quietly, as a feeling you begin to trust. You start to notice things you didn't see before, small details that suddenly feel important, moments that look clearer than they used to, and with that clarity comes something even stronger, a sense that you finally understand what's going on. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to feel different than before. Enough to believe you're no longer reacting blindly, that now you're making decisions with purpose, with awareness, with control. And that changes the way you approach everything, because you're no longer just participating, you're trying to be precise. You wait longer. You observe more carefully. You tell yourself you won't rush, that you'll only act when everything makes sense, when the moment feels right, when there's no doubt left. And eventually that moment appears. It looks clean. It looks structured. It looks exactly like what you've been waiting for. This is it. And that thought feels justified. Not emotional, not impulsive, but logical, supported by everything you've learned, everything you've seen, everything you now believe you understand. So you act calmly, confidently, without hesitation, because hesitation feels like something you've already outgrown. And somewhere else, at that exact same moment, someone else is looking at the same situation, thinking the same thought, reaching the same conclusion, feeling the same quiet confidence that tells them, this makes sense. And they act just like you, not because they're copying you, not because they know you exist, but because they followed the same path, learned the same patterns, trusted the same logic, and what feels like independent thinking begins to align, slowly, without resistance. because it still feels personal. It still feels like your decision. It still feels like control. And that's what makes it so convincing, because nothing about it feels wrong. Nothing about it feels forced. Nothing about it feels uncertain anymore. In fact, it feels better than before, cleaner than before, more controlled than before. And that's exactly why you trust it. You trust the moment. You trust your understanding. You trust the process that brought you here. But what feels like control isn't always control. Because the moment something feels obvious, the moment it feels clear enough that there's nothing left to question, that's when it stops being unique and starts becoming shared, not just by you, but by everyone who learned to see things the same way. And without realizing it, you're no longer just making a decision. You're stepping into a pattern. And this is the moment that feels different, but isn't. Because everything about it looks better than before. Cleaner, more structured, more controlled. And that's exactly why it's so convincing. You're not rushing. You're not guessing. You're not reacting the way you used to. You're following something that feels thought out, something that feels earned, something that feels like progress. This time it works. That thought doesn't come from emotion. It comes from confidence, from repetition, from the belief that you've seen enough to understand what's about to happen. And for a moment, it feels calm, almost quiet, like there's nothing left to question. You've done this before, but now it feels better. And that's the difference that traps you, because the structure is the same, even if the feeling isn't. You see the moment, you recognize it, you act on it, and everything in your mind tells you this is not the same as before. This is improved, refined, more precise. You're not making the old mistake. You're making a better decision. But the process hasn't changed. Only your confidence has. And that confidence removes the last bit of hesitation that used to protect you, the small pause that once made you question the moment, the instinct that once made you step back and think again. Now it's gone, replaced by something that feels stronger, but isn't. Because at that exact same moment, others are doing the same thing, not randomly, not emotionally, but with the same confidence, the same reasoning, the same belief that this time it's different. And that's what makes it the same. Because when enough people reach the same conclusion in the same way at the same time, the outcome stops being about the decision itself. It becomes about the behavior behind it. And behavior, when repeated, becomes predictable. Not to you, but to the system you're inside. And that's where the shift happens. Not in what you see, not in what you believe, but in what you don't notice. Because while you're focused on being right, on improving, on doing it better than before, you're moving through the exact same structure that led you here last time. It just feels different. More controlled, more certain, more justified. But the result doesn't care how it feels. It follows the same path. And by the time you realize it, you're already there again. And at some point, something doesn't sit right. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that immediately forces you to stop, but just enough to make you pause for a second and feel that something is off, because you've seen this before. Not exactly the same, not identical, but close enough that it starts to feel familiar in a way you can't ignore. You begin to notice the pattern, not all at once, but piece by piece, moment by moment, as you look back and realize that the path you thought was progress looks strangely similar to where you've already been. The setup felt better, the timing felt cleaner, the decision felt stronger, but the outcome hasn't really changed. And that's where the question shifts. Not what did I do wrong, but why does this feel the same? Because it shouldn't. It should feel different if you're improving. It should lead somewhere new. It should break the cycle you've been stuck in, and yet it doesn't. It repeats, just with a different surface, a different explanation, a slightly different story that still leads you back to the same point. And that's when you start to see it more clearly, not as a mistake, not as bad luck, not as something you can fix with one more adjustment, but as something deeper, something that has been there from the beginning. Pattern, not in the situation, in you, in the way you see things, in the way you react, in the way you arrive at decisions that feel right in the moment, because those decisions are not as unique as they feel. They follow a structure, a path shaped by everything you've learned, everything you've practiced, everything you now trust. And that trust is what makes it repeat. Because the moment you feel certain, the moment everything looks clear enough that there's nothing left to question, you move faster, cleaner, without hesitation, and that removes the only thing that could have made you different: doubt. And without doubt, your decision becomes simple. Too simple. Because now it's not just your decision, it's the same decision made by countless others, all following the same logic, all reaching the same conclusion, all stepping into the same moment, believing it's theirs. But it isn't. Never was. And once you see that, really see it, it becomes difficult to go back to the way you thought before, because you begin to understand that what felt like improvement was just repetition made stronger by confidence. Not a new path, just the same path, walked with more certainty. And once you see it, you can't unsee it, because it changes the way you look at everything that came before, not as a series of mistakes, not as bad timing, not as something you simply need to fix, but as something far more consistent, something that was there the entire time, quietly shaping every decision you thought was your own. Because it was never just about being right, and it was never just about learning more, trying harder, or improving the way you act in the moment. It was about the fact that your decisions were never as unique as they felt. They followed a path shaped by logic, by repetition, by everything that made sense to you and to everyone else thinking the same way. And that's the part that's difficult to accept, because it takes away the comfort of believing that one more adjustment, one more insight, one more attempt will suddenly change everything. Because it won't. Not if the way you think stays the same. Not if the process that leads you to that moment remains untouched. Because the moment your thinking aligns perfectly with what feels obvious, what feels clear, what feels right, is often the moment you become the easiest to predict. And prediction is all that's needed, not to stop you, not to single you out, but to position against the behavior you represent. Because the system doesn't need to know who you are, it only needs to know what you're likely to do next. And once that becomes clear, the outcome begins to follow. Not because you're wrong, but because you're expected. And that's the difference that most people never stop to consider. Because being wrong feels like something you can fix, something you can improve, something you can correct over time. But being predictable is something you don't even notice while it's happening, because it feels like progress, it feels like control, it feels like you're finally getting closer. But you're not. You're just repeating the same path with more confidence. And that confidence is what keeps you there, because it removes hesitation, it removes doubt, it removes the only thing that could have made you stop and question the moment before stepping into it again. And without that pause, the pattern continues, quietly, consistently, without resistance, until you begin to ask a different question. Not what am I doing wrong, but why does this keep happening the same way? Because once that question appears, something shifts, not in the situation, not in the outcome, but in the way you see it. Because you're no longer looking for a better decision, you're starting to see the structure behind it. And that's where everything begins to change. Because the system doesn't need you to be wrong. It only needs you to be easy to read,